October 3, 1884. The creek bed was a filigree of cracked mud, and the air tasted of dust. 18-year-old Adelaide Finch knelt at the edge of what had once been a steady current, her German shepherd, Fen, sitting patient and still beside her. His amber eyes watched not the dry creek, but the girl. In her hand, she held a small, smooth river stone, worn into a perfect oval by a century of water that was no longer there. She turned it over and over, its coolness a phantom memory of the life that had vanished from this place. The town of Providence, nestled in a fold of the Dakota Hills, had been built on the promise of that water. Now, the promise was broken. Adelaide looked from the stone in her palm to the vast, indifferent sky, a sheet of pale, merciless blue. What nobody knew was that for Adelaide, the drought had started a year earlier. It had begun not in the sky, but in the whispers and sideways glances of the very people who now prayed for rain. They called her strange for the way she watched the world, for the small leather-bound book she carried, filled with her father's spidery script about rock strata and water tables. He had been a prospector who found nothing but theories, and he had left her with nothing but his mind. In a town that valued strong backs over sharp wits, this inheritance was a curse. Reverend Blackwood had made sure of it. From his pulpit, he spoke of the simple virtues of faith and labor, his gaze often finding Adelaide in the back pew, her head bent over her father's notes. He called her observations prideful, her silence a judgment. The town, fearful and eager for a target, had followed his lead. The mockery was quiet at first, like the rustle of dry leaves, but it grew into a steady wind that pushed her to the very edge of their society. She lived in a small, weathered cabin her father had built, a place that clung to the hillside just outside the town proper. It was there she and Fen kept to themselves. But isolation is a kind of thirst, too. She had felt the town's goodwill dry up long before the creek did, and she had learned a hard lesson from both. You cannot rely on what is given. You must find your own source. Therefore, she had started digging. The work had begun last spring, a secret labor born of foresight and spite. She found the place by accident, or perhaps by instinct, following a fault line her father had mapped in his book. It was a narrow fissure hidden behind a thicket of stubborn buckthorn, an opening that breathed a cool, damp air unlike the baked heat of the prairie. It was the entrance to a small network of limestone caves. To anyone else, it was a hole in the ground. To Adelaide, it was the answer to a prayer she had never dared to speak aloud. A place to build a world of her own. The first descent into the cave was a journey into cold silence. Fen whined softly at the entrance, his paws planted, unwilling to follow her into the dark. Adelaide lit a tallow lamp, the small flame pushing back a darkness that felt ancient and absolute. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and stone, a clean, mineral smell that was the opposite of the dusty world above. The caves were not vast, just a series of connected chambers, the largest no bigger than the town's small chapel. The ground was uneven, a mix of rock and dense, packed clay. But what made her stop, what made her hold the lamp high and feel a tremor of possibility, was the moisture. The far wall of the main chamber wept. Tiny, glistening beads of water traced paths down the stone, collecting in a small, muddy puddle on the floor. It wasn't a stream, not even a trickle. It was a seep, a slow, patient bleeding from the heart of the earth. Her father had written of such things. He believed the deep aquifers, the hidden rivers beneath the prairie, were the real treasure of this land. He was right. He had just been looking for the wrong color. Holding the lamp closer, she saw that the floor of the largest chamber was not flat. It had natural depressions, shallow basins carved by millennia of slow dripping. Here, her plan began to take shape, a wild and audacious idea. She would not just survive the town's scorn and the sky's cruelty. She would create life where none was meant to exist. She would build a farm under the ground. The work was a kind of fury. She had only a rusty spade and a heavy pickaxe her father had left behind. The first week was a testament to pain. Her hands, accustomed to mending and gardening, blistered, then bled, then hardened into calloused leather. She would work until the lamp burned low, her muscles screaming, her breath coming in ragged gasps in the cool, still air. Fen would wait for her at the entrance, a silent, worried guardian. When she emerged, Covered in clay and sweat, he would lick her hands, his presence the only comfort she had. She started with the largest basin, deepening it, shaping it. The limestone was soft enough to chip away with the pickaxe, but the labor was immense. Each swing sent a shock up her arms. Each shovelful of rock and clay was a victory. She wasn't just digging a hole. She was carving out a space for herself, a sanctuary built by her own strength, hidden from the judging eyes of Providence. Mr. Abram, the town blacksmith, was the only one who seemed to notice her without judgment. He was a quiet, hulking man whose own grief had walled him off from the town years ago. He saw her one evening, hauling buckets of dense clay away from the hills, her back straight with effort. He said nothing. But the next morning, leaning against her cabin door, was a new shovel head, its edge honed sharp and true, and a pair of thick leather gloves. There was no note. None was needed. It was a gesture of respect from one outcast to another, a silent acknowledgement of hard work. The unspoken words fortified her more than any sermon. She fitted the new head to her shovel and returned to the dark, her resolve hardened like the steel in her hands. The first pool took a month to dig. It was 10 feet across and 4 feet deep, its sides sloped and smooth. The next challenge was making it hold water. The limestone was porous, and the water from the seep, slow as it was, would drain away. Her father's book spoke of bentonite clay, a miraculous substance that swelled when wet, creating a waterproof seal. She had seen scenes of it miles up the dry creek bed, a pale, grey-green layer between bands of sandstone. Getting it was another secret pilgrimage. She went at night, with Fen as her only companion, the moon her only lamp. She filled burlap sacks with the heavy clay, her body straining under the weight on the long walk back. For a week, she worked the grey clay into the bottom and sides of the pool, pounding it flat with a heavy stone, her hands and arms caked in the smooth, cool mud. She built a small channel from the weeping wall, a tiny aqueduct of carefully placed stones, to guide the slow drops of water into her new pond. Then, she waited. The first day, the water level rose by less than an inch. It was a test of the patience she had learned from years of being alone. She did not despair. She began digging the second pool, a smaller one next to the first, while the seep filled her creation drop by patient drop. In the world above, the drought tightened its grip. The summer was long and brutal. The corn in the fields grew stunted and withered. The town's well level dropped, and the water they drew was murky and tasted of silt. People's faces grew tight with worry. Reverend Blackwood preached of repentance, his sermons growing more fervent, his eyes burning with a zeal that felt like another kind of heat. He spoke of the town's secret sins being punished by a righteous heaven, and though he never said her name, many in the congregation would turn to look toward the empty space in the back pew where Adelaide used to sit. They did not see a sinner. They saw a scapegoat. Adelaide heard the talk when she made her rare trips to the general store for salt and flour. The whispers followed her like her own shadow. They said she was godless. They said she was a witch, consorting with the earth in unnatural ways. The rumors were fed by her isolation, by her strange, solitary purpose. They saw her filthy, her nails permanently rimmed with dirt, and they saw proof of her strangeness, not her labor. She ignored them. Their words were dust. Down in the earth, she had water. After 3 weeks, the first pool was full. The water was crystal clear and cold, a perfect, still mirror in the lamplight. It was time to bring it to life. This was the most perilous part of her plan. The river, miles south, was a shadow of itself, but one deep, shaded bend still held water, and with it, life. She needed fish. The journey to the river was a gamble. It meant leaving her sanctuary for 2 full nights, traveling across open country where a lone girl was a target. She packed light, dried jerky, a full canteen, and her father's book. She also carried a net she had painstakingly woven from twine and a series of buckets fitted with damp moss to keep them cool. Fen paced at her side, his senses on high alert, a low growl rumbling in his chest at the snap of every twig. They walked under the cover of darkness, resting during the oppressive heat of the day in the shade of rocky outcrops. The world felt empty, bleached by the sun. She saw no one. It was as if the drought had scoured the land of all but the most stubborn life. When she finally reached the river bend, the sight was both a relief and a sorrow. A long, dark pool of water lay protected by a high, rocky bank, but all around it the riverbed was bone dry. This was the last bastion of a dying ecosystem. She worked quickly, wading into the cool water, casting her net again and again. She was looking for the young, the fry and fingerlings, small enough to transport and resilient enough to adapt. She caught native trout and a few hardy catfish, their small bodies wriggling with a life force that felt sacred. She carefully placed them in the buckets, layering them with wet cloths and the moss she had gathered. The walk back was slower, more fraught. She was a shepherd of a fragile flock, every step a prayer that they would survive. She checked them constantly, refreshing the water from her canteen, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. When she finally saw the familiar shape of the hills that hid her cave, a wave of exhaustion and relief washed over her. She and Fen had made it. Getting the buckets down the narrow entrance was a final, grueling test of her strength. But when she released the small fish into the cold, clear water of her pool, watching them dart and explore their new home, the weariness vanished. They were beautiful. They were alive. They were hers. Now, she had to feed them. Her solution was as ingenious as the farm itself. In a smaller, warmer chamber of the cave, she created a nursery for worms and insects. She hauled in buckets of rich, loamy soil from a shaded patch of woods, mixing it with vegetable scraps from her own meager meals and leaf litter. She kept the soil damp, and soon it was teeming with earthworms, grubs, and beetles. It was a small, self-sustaining world of decay and rebirth. Every day, she would harvest a handful and feed her growing fish. She watched them flourish, their silvery bodies growing sleek and strong in the pristine water. She had done it. She had bent the rules of nature, creating an oasis of life in a world that was slowly dying. She had built a future, hidden deep within the earth. As autumn bled into a bleak, early winter, the situation in Providence grew dire. The final harvest had failed completely. The meager reserves in the town storehouse, meant to last until spring, were found to be riddled with weevils and mold. The shipment of supplies they expected from the east never arrived, the Missouri River was too low for the barges to pass. The town was cut off, an island in a sea of barren prairie. The first snows came, but they were a cruel joke, a thin, dry powder that did nothing to replenish the earth. They only added a bitter cold to the gnawing hunger. The faces in town grew gaunt, their eyes hollowed out with fear. The usual sounds of a community, the laughter of children, the ring of Mr. Abrams' hammer on the anvil, the hearty greetings, all faded into a tense, worried silence. Fights broke out over the last bags of flour at the general store. Old friendships frayed and snapped under the strain. Reverend Blackwood's sermons became desperate, almost hysterical. He preached that this was a test of faith, a divine crucible to burn away their sins. He led prayer vigils that lasted late into the night, the voices from the chapel sounding thin and reedy against the vast, cold silence of the plains. Adelaide watched it all from a distance. She had enough to sustain herself. Her small garden had yielded a poor crop, but she had her stores of preserved vegetables, and more importantly, she had her fish. She had dug a third, even larger pool, and it was now home to a thriving population. The first generation was breeding. The sight of the tiny, darting fry filled her with a profound sense of accomplishment. She was not just a survivor. She was a creator. Her feelings toward the town were a tangled knot of pity, anger, and a strange sense of responsibility. These were the people who had scorned her, who had made her feel like a ghost in her own home. But they were also the only people she had. She saw Mrs. Gable, a woman who had always given her a sour look, now stumbling through the snow, her face a mask of despair. She saw children with pinched, pale faces, their energy gone. She heard stories of families boiling leather from old boots to make a thin, wretched soup. Her anger began to feel like a luxury she could no longer afford. The turning point came on a fiercely cold day in January. She was near the edge of town, gathering firewood, when she saw a small commotion outside the chapel. A young boy, son of one of the farmers who had mocked her father's theories most loudly, had collapsed in the snow. His mother's scream was a raw, animal sound of pure agony. It cut through the cold air and lodged itself in Adelaide's heart. She stood frozen, hidden by the trees, watching as they carried the limp boy inside. She knew then that her secret could not be kept. Her knowledge, her work, was not just for her anymore. It was a debt she owed, not to the people who had hurt her, but to the simple fact of their shared humanity. That night, she did not go to the cave. She sat at her small wooden table, the lamp casting a warm glow on her father's book. Fen rested his head on her lap, sensing the shift in her. She was no longer just protecting her creation. She was preparing to give it away. She chose her moment carefully. She waited 2 days, letting the town's desperation reach its peak. The boy had survived, but he was weak, and his collapse had shattered the last vestiges of the town's denial. They were starving, and faith alone was not filling their bellies. Instead of going to the reverend or the town council, she went to the one person who had shown her a sliver of kindness. She walked to the blacksmith's forge, the cold air biting at her face. Mr. Abram was inside, staring into the dead coals of his fire pit, his big shoulders slumped. He looked up as she entered, his eyes showing no surprise, only a deep, weary sadness. Fen stood at her side, a silent, steady presence. "Mr. Abram," she said, her voice clear and even. "The town is hungry," he gave a short, bitter laugh. "The town is dying, girl. I have food," she said. He stared at her, his expression unreadable. He saw her worn clothes, her thin frame. He likely thought she was offering her own meager rations, a gesture of foolish charity. "You have nothing to spare," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "I have more than enough," she replied. "I have fish. Enough for everyone. But I will need your help to bring it to them." A flicker of disbelief crossed his face, followed by a dawning curiosity. He had seen her work for months, had seen the impossible load she carried, the dirt that never left her. He had never asked, but he had wondered. He looked from her determined face to the intelligent, watchful dog at her side. He had lived long enough to know that the world held more secrets than most people imagined. "Show me," he said, his voice a low rumble. She led him out of town and up the hillside, the snow crunching under their boots. She took him to the hidden fissure, pulled back the branches, and gestured for him to follow. He hesitated for only a moment before lighting a lantern and descending into the earth behind her. The sight that greeted him in the main chamber silenced him completely. In the warm, steady glow of his lantern, the pools of water shimmered. They were alive, teeming with hundreds of healthy, darting fish. The air was cool and clean, the sound of the dripping seep a gentle, rhythmic pulse. It was a miracle, but it was a miracle born of sweat and calluses, of thought and planning. He walked to the edge of the largest pool, his mouth slightly agape. He looked at the intricate channel of stones, the smooth, clay-lined walls, the separate, smaller pool where the young were growing. He turned and looked at Adelaide, and for the first time, he saw her not as a strange, solitary girl, but as a force of nature in her own right. "How?" he whispered, the single word full of awe. "My father's notes," she said simply, tapping the leather-bound book at her belt. And a strong back. He was silent for a long time, the weight of what she had accomplished settling upon him. He understood the months of secret labor, the immense will it must have taken. He understood the silence, the need to protect this from a world that would not have understood. "The Reverend says this drought is God's will," he said, his voice thick with a new, cold anger. Adelaide looked at the life she had fostered in the dark. "Then God helps those who dig," he nodded slowly, a deep and profound respect dawning in his eyes. "What do you need me to do?" Their return to Providence was a quiet procession of two. Mr. Abram carried 2 heavy buckets, water sloshing over the sides, filled with large, glistening trout. Adelaide walked beside him, Fen at her heels. They did not go to the chapel. They went to the center of town, where a few listless and hollow-eyed residents were gathered around a small, smoky fire. At the sight of the fish, a stunned silence fell over the small crowd. Someone pointed, a choked cry escaping their lips. People began to emerge from their homes, drawn by the commotion. They stared at the fish as if it were an apparition. It was more food than they had seen in one place in months. Reverend Blackwood pushed his way through the crowd, his face a thunderous mask of suspicion. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice booming with authority. "Where did this come from?" Mr. Abram set the buckets down. "This is from Adelaide Finch," he said, his voice steady and strong, carrying across the silent square. "She has food for the town." All eyes turned to Adelaide. They were filled with a confusing mixture of shock, disbelief, and a desperate, rising hope. They looked at this strange, dirt-stained girl they had ostracized, the girl they had whispered about, and they could not reconcile her with this impossible bounty. "It's a trick," the Reverend spat, his eyes wild. "This is unnatural. The devil's work to tempt us away from faith." But his words, which once held such power, now rang hollow. The raw, undeniable reality of the fish in the buckets was more potent than any sermon. The smell of fresh water, the sight of living food, was a more powerful gospel than any he could offer. A woman, the mother of the boy who had collapsed, stepped forward. Her eyes were red-rimmed from weeping, but as she looked at Adelaide, they filled with a dawning, tearful gratitude. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We are so hungry." Adelaide gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to Mr. Abram. He took one of the largest trout from the bucket and handed it to the woman. She clutched it to her chest as if it were a bar of gold, tears streaming down her face. That simple act broke the spell. A clamor arose, not of anger, but of desperate, pleading need. Reverend Blackwood tried to shout them down, but no one was listening anymore. Their hunger was a more immediate god. Adelaide stood calm amidst the chaos. She had known this moment would come. "There is more," she announced, her voice cutting through the noise. "There is enough for everyone. But you will listen. You will be orderly. And you will learn." She turned and started walking back toward the hills. This time, the whole town followed. The journey to the cave was a pilgrimage of the shamed and the desperate. They followed her in a straggling line, their faces etched with a mixture of hope and trepidation. When she led them into the earth, one by one, their gasps of awe echoed in the cavern. They saw her creation, this impossible sanctuary of life, and they finally understood. They saw the evidence of her labor, the brilliance of her mind, and the depth of her foresight. They stood in humbled silence, their torches and lanterns casting flickering shadows on the walls, illuminating the miracle she had built while they had been busy casting stones. In the weeks that followed, the cave became the heart of Providence. Adelaide, once the town outcast, was now its reluctant leader. She established a system, a fair and orderly rationing that ensured everyone got a share. She was not a queen or a prophet. She was an engineer, a teacher. She showed them how the pools worked, how to maintain the delicate balance of the ecosystem she had created. She taught them how to harvest the fish without depleting the stock, how to cultivate the worm beds, how to respect the slow, patient life of the cave. Mr. Abram became her quiet lieutenant, his presence a bulwark against any lingering dissent. His forge, once silent, now rang with the sound of him crafting hooks and tools they needed for the new work. The people of Providence learned humility. The men who had laughed at her father's foolishness now listened intently as she explained the principles of hydrology. The women who had whispered about her strangeness now came to her with questions, their eyes filled with a new, profound respect. They learned to work together, their shared labor in the quiet dark of the cave healing the fractures that hunger and fear had created. They were no longer just a collection of desperate individuals. They were a community again, bound together by their reliance on the strange girl they had once cast out. Reverend Blackwood was a broken man. His authority had evaporated in the face of Adelaide's quiet competence. His sermons about faith and punishment seemed absurd in a world saved by geology and hard work. He tried to reclaim his power, declaring the fish a gift from God, a reward for their prayers, with Adelaide merely the vessel. But no one believed him. They had seen the calluses on her hands. They knew this was no divine miracle. This was a human one. He eventually fell silent, a hollowed-out man haunting the edges of the community he had once commanded. Adelaide never spoke a word against him. She did not need to. Her victory was not in his defeat, but in the survival of the town. She demanded no apologies. She accepted no special praise. Her reward was in the work itself, in the quiet satisfaction of seeing her creation sustain life. She was still quiet, still solitary in her own way, but she was no longer alone. She had found her place, not by conforming to their world, but by making them a part of hers. The isolation she had once endured had become her greatest strength. It had given her the time to think, the space to build, and the clarity to see what no one else could. She had turned the stones they threw at her into the foundation of their salvation. Spring arrived late that year, but when it came with a gentle, steady rain. For 3 days, the sky wept, the water soaking into the parched earth, filling the creek bed with a muddy, gurgling current. The world turned from brown to a soft, tentative green. The long drought was broken. The people of Providence watched the rain with a joy that was deep and reverent. They were no longer helpless supplicants begging the sky for mercy. The winter had taught them a hard lesson about the fragility of their existence, but it had also taught them about their own resilience. They had survived, not by prayer alone, but by the ingenuity and labor of one of their own. The arrival of the rain did not make the fish farm obsolete. It became a permanent part of their community, a symbol of their ordeal and their deliverance. It was their insurance against the whims of nature, a legacy of the winter they had almost not survived. They continued to tend to it, the knowledge Adelaide had given them passing from parent to child. It was a new story for their town, a founding myth born not of conquest or gold, but of water and wisdom in the dark belly of the earth. Adelaide never left Providence. She remained in her small cabin on the hillside, with Fen, who was now old and grey around the muzzle, always at her side. She did not marry. She did not seek a position of power. She was simply Adelaide Finch, the woman who listened to the earth. People would bring her things, small gifts of gratitude, a finely knitted shawl, a jar of the first wild berry jam, a newly sharpened axe head from Mr. Abram. She accepted them with a quiet nod, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that now existed between them. Sometimes, children would come to her cabin, not in mockery, but in awe. They would ask to see her father's book, and she would let them turn the worn pages, showing them the spidery drawings of rock and water. She was teaching them to see the world as she did, to look beneath the surface of things. Her legacy would not be a name on a monument. It would be in the way they looked at a dry creek bed and understood the river that still flowed beneath, unseen but essential. One evening, years later, she stood at the entrance to her cave. The air was cool and smelled of damp soil and new leaves. The town below was lit with the warm, scattered lights of home. She could hear the faint sound of a fiddle and laughter carrying on the breeze. She placed a hand on Fen's head, his fur soft and familiar beneath her palm. In her other hand, she held the same smooth river stone she had held on that dusty day so long ago. She had saved them, yes. But in doing so, she had found a way to save herself from the bitterness that could have easily consumed her. She had not sought revenge. She had sought life. And in the dark, she had found it in abundance. The stone was cool in her hand. The earth was patient. And the water, she knew, always finds its way home.